Let me start by saying that when the Galactic Council told humanity to stop existing, they expected panic, surrender, or at least some dignified pleading. Instead, they got a politely worded inquiry asking if they'd prefer us to cease existing all at once or gradually. For scheduling purposes, this is what happens when you threaten a species that weaponizes bureaucracy and sarcasm better than plasma cannons. Most species receive an extinction notice and start building fortifications or writing wills. The Bither would begin orbital fortifications within hours. The Krellex would dispatch their genetic legacy ships. Standard crisis behavior across known space involves measurable panic responses and predictable defensive postures. The Galactic Council's message followed their established protocol for primitive species termination. Brutally simple, utterly final. Cease to exist or be erased. No negotiation, no discussion. Just cosmic finality delivered through official channels. They expected terror from Earth. They anticipated desperate counter-threats or pathetic submission from what their scouts classified as a divided, pre-unification world. Their psychological profiles suggested humans would fracture into competing factions, begging separately for mercy. Instead, the transmission hit Earth's unified defense network and triggered exactly one administrative flag. The notification pinged on Commander Sterling's console with the same priority level as a quarterly budget review. Lieutenant Webb actually thought it might be a misaddressed wedding invitation at first glance. Sterling and Webb didn't reach for weapons controls or evacuation protocols. They pulled up procedural manuals and interdepartmental communication templates. They treated the extinction order like a complex zoning variance request from a difficult neighbor. Their analysis focused on the message's formatting inconsistencies rather than its apocalyptic content. The Council's standardized threat delivery system had 17 documented procedural flaws in its metadata structure. Humans found 23. The Council's bureaucracy operated on strict interpretation protocols for 3 centuries without incident. Their systems couldn't process a species that treated ultimatums as opening positions in a negotiation. They'd never encountered recipients who analyzed the threat delivery mechanism instead of the threat itself. This was their first unforced error since the Zeron Confederation incident, and humanity spotted it immediately. Earth's response began with a request for clarification on Form GC-7B, subsection 12 regarding termination logistics. They needed to know preferred timeframe parameters for ceasing existence. They inquired about whether phased de-existence would require staggered departmental shutdowns or could proceed simultaneously across all continents. They asked about archival procedures for cultural artifacts post-elimination. The response included 3 attachment files and a FAQs document, which brings us to the most politely worded act of defiance in cosmic history. A 17-paragraph administrative inquiry that agreed with the Council's assessment while simultaneously questioning their operational competency. The message concluded by thanking them for their attention to this matter and looking forward to their guidance on implementation specifics. It was signed by 14 department heads and copied to 3 irrelevant committees. Here's the thing about threatening humans. We treat rudeness as a procedural error. When Commander Sterling and Lieutenant Webb drafted their response to the Galactic Council, they approached it like a customer service inquiry rather than a diplomatic communication. They used templates normally reserved for addressing municipal parking violations and utility billing disputes. The document formatting alone would have made any interstellar bureaucrat weep with admiration. Perfect margins, standardized header protocols, and precisely calibrated diplomatic language that fell exactly within established communication guidelines. They opened by thanking the Council for their valuable feedback regarding human existence parameters. The second paragraph expressed appreciation for the notification arriving during Earth's particularly busy governing schedule, implying the extinction order had been slotted between infrastructure maintenance and education reform on their priority list. They included a detailed questionnaire about preferred extinction methodologies, with checkboxes for gradual phase-out versus immediate termination. The attached spreadsheet calculated resource reallocation projections for both scenarios. This wasn't defiance in any traditional sense. It was weaponized administrative compliance. They followed every Galactic Council communication protocol to the letter, while simultaneously undermining the entire premise of the threat. Their systems couldn't process a response that technically agreed with their demands while being fundamentally obstructive. The threat assessment algorithms kept flagging the message as cooperative, while the sentiment analysis modules reported extreme passive aggression. The conflict resolution subroutines attempted to categorize it under hospitality industry complaints before defaulting to undefined linguistic anomaly. Their translation matrices struggled with human sarcasm, formatted as bureaucratic politeness. The systems interpreted phrases like, "We appreciate your consideration of our existential status as genuine gratitude." When humans asked about post-existence asset distribution protocols, the computers analyzed it as legitimate logistical planning. The Council's communication, officers spent 3 cycles trying to determine whether they'd received surrender documents or a particularly elaborate complaint, formed the aggressively polite surrender inquiry became humanity's first strategic victory without a single weapon being charged or defense system activated. It created more confusion than any military response could have achieved. Council aides began checking whether they'd accidentally threatened a hospitality guild or tourism board instead of a planetary government. Lower-level functionaries started drafting apologies before their superiors realized the response wasn't actually an error. At one point, a mid-level administrator nearly approved Earth's request for a 6-month extinction extension to complete ongoing infrastructure projects. The request included detailed project timelines and cost-benefit analyses that made gradual planetary dissolution appear more efficient than immediate termination. 3 separate departments began preliminary work on human extinction implementation guidelines before someone realized they were essentially planning the Council's first assisted suicide of an entire civilization. The thing is, when you've spent centuries dealing with species that either fight or flee, you don't develop protocols for handling someone who responds to annihilation with a request for more paperwork. Humanity's first contact with Galactic Authority demonstrated that sometimes the most effective weapon is a perfectly formatted document with just the right amount of bureaucratic friction. You know, while the Council debated our tone, we built defenses with bureaucratic names. Earth mobilized not with war cries but with operational code names and project charts that sounded like municipal improvement initiatives. The Global Defense Network operated under the designation Orbital Infrastructure Modernization Project. Funding requests went through normal civil engineering approval channels. Contract bids appeared on standard government procurement websites. The entire planetary defense strategy looked like a particularly ambitious public works program. Defensive satellites registered as communication relays and weather monitoring stations. Their technical specifications emphasized data collection capabilities while downplaying their targeting systems. The deployment schedules matched regional infrastructure upgrade timelines rather than military readiness deadlines. Council surveillance showed humans installing what appeared to be enhanced meteorological equipment across orbital sectors. Their analysts concluded we were improving climate prediction models while facing extinction. Kinetic platforms filed permits as orbital debris management systems. The documentation described them as collision avoidance networks for protecting communication satellites. Engineers submitted environmental impact statements emphasizing their role in space traffic safety. The platforms themselves resembled standard orbital maintenance vehicles with extra sensor arrays. Council observers noted the increased space activity, but categorized it as infrastructure expansion rather than military preparation. Apex Dynamics developed gravity well disruptors under environmental research grant studying tidal forces. The project proposals focused on lunar orbit stabilization and earthquake prediction modeling. Research papers discussed gravitational field modulation for scientific measurement purposes. The actual devices could redirect small asteroids or alter local gravity fields around approaching vessels. Council science reviewers approved the research as legitimate planetary study, while missing the defensive applications. Every weapon system wore civilian clothing. Point defense lasers registered as atmospheric analysis tools. Shield generators appeared as experimental climate control systems. Even the Planetary Early Warning Network masqueraded as a global astronomy initiative mapping near-Earth objects. The coordination happened through normal governmental channels using standardized administrative language. Procurement officers processed orders for high-energy measurement devices and atmospheric perturbation sensors. The Council's spies reported humanity preparing for improved orbital logistics and enhanced space-based services. Their intelligence assessments described Earth as strangely focused on infrastructure development during crisis. Analysts speculated we were attempting to leave behind functional systems for whatever species inherited the planet. They completely missed the military capability developing beneath the dull terminology and bureaucratic processes. Earth created a formidable defense while looking like it was just organizing paperwork and upgrading municipal services. Training exercises occurred under the guise of disaster preparedness drills. Weapons testing happened during scheduled infrastructure stress tests. The entire global defense buildup occurred in plain sight while appearing utterly mundane to external observers. The thing is, when your enemy thinks you're filing forms and updating transportation networks, they don't expect railguns and planetary shields. The Council had extensive protocols for detecting military mobilization patterns. They understood warfleet construction timelines and defense network activation sequences. They had no framework for analyzing a species that prepared for interstellar conflict by submitting building permits and environmental impact reports. Their threat assessment models simply couldn't process a civilization that approached planetary defense like urban planning. Let me start by saying no other species would weaponize flightless birds. The Council's tactical projections for Australia showed standard defense installations, coastal plasma batteries, desert missile silos, maybe some orbital launch facilities hidden in the outback. Their invasion scenarios accounted for conventional resistance from a developed continental power. They anticipated laser grids and energy shields, not biological interference patterns and territorial avian behavior. Their entire military doctrine lacked protocols for dealing with aggressive wildlife as a strategic asset. Australia's contribution was officially designated Operation Feather Duster in the Global Defense Network. The name sounded like a cleaning initiative or agricultural project. Budget allocations appeared under wildlife management and ecological preservation. The Council's financial analysts saw the funding requests and assumed humans were trying to protect endangered species before extinction. They completely missed that the emu conservation effort was actually a military deployment in disguise. Instead of plasma weapons, they got 50,000 emus fitted with miniature laser designation units. Australian engineers developed feather-mounted targeting systems that blended seamlessly with the birds' natural plumage. The units drew power from kinetic generators that harvested energy from the emu's movement. Maintenance crews disguised as wildlife conservation officers would replenish the power cells during scheduled ecological surveys. The entire system operated without the birds even noticing the hardware. These birds weren't weapons themselves. They were mobile targeting systems for orbital platforms. Each MU carried equipment that could paint ground targets for precision strikes from space. The system used the birds' natural movement patterns to create unpredictable targeting coverage. Emus would wander through potential landing zones, their designation units automatically activating when they detected specific metallic signatures or energy readings. The orbital platforms only needed milliseconds of target lock from any single bird. The emus would swarm landing zones, confusing sensors and painting targets simultaneously across wide areas. Their movement patterns created overlapping targeting coverage that conventional military systems couldn't counter. Invasion forces would find themselves tracked by dozens of independent designation sources, moving erratically through the landscape. Trying to eliminate the threat meant firing on what appeared to be native wildlife. While orbital weapons locked onto your position, Council neural scans would show overwhelming avian patterns amid combat data. Their tactical computers kept reporting biological interference and environmental sensor contamination. Analysts initially thought the emus were just native fauna, accidentally caught in the conflict zone. Then they noticed the precise timing of the targeting locks coinciding with specific birds passing near military assets. The realization dawned slowly. They weren't fighting humans, they were fighting an ecosystem that had been weaponized. Military planners couldn't process a threat that involved territorial birds. Their training covered urban combat, orbital engagements, and planetary invasion scenarios. None of their manuals contained chapters on countering militarily enhanced wildlife. Officers found themselves having to consider things like mating seasons and feeding patterns when planning operations. Intelligence briefings started including EMU movement forecasts and nesting ground assessments. The laser-designated EMUs became the perfect psychological warfare tool. Invasion troops would land in what appeared to be empty territory, only to find themselves surrounded by giant birds that seemed to be watching them. The constant, unblinking scrutiny from creatures that showed no fear of advanced technology unsettled even veteran soldiers. The emus didn't behave like combatants or civilians. They just went about their business while accidentally turning entire armored columns into target practice. Which brings us to the only military strategy that requires birdseed and targeting lasers. Maintenance crews had to coordinate with wildlife experts to ensure the emus remained healthy and territorially assertive. The success of the entire defense strategy depended on keeping 50,000 birds adequately fed and sufficiently irritated by intruders. Quartermasters found themselves requisitioning both advanced targeting components and bulk grain shipments. Tactical meetings included discussions about optimal feeding schedules and nesting site preservation. Here's the thing about unconditional surrender. Humans treat it as a negotiation starting point. The Council delivered their final ultimatum with the standard 72-cycle deadline for compliance. They expected either desperate resistance or broken acceptance. Their invasion fleets moved into position, tactical systems primed for either scenario. Intelligence analysts prepared for last-minute diplomatic appeals or 11th-hour military innovations. What they received was immediate, cheerful agreement that arrived 17 cycles ahead of schedule. Humanity's surrender transmission opened with gratitude for the reasonable time frame and appreciation for the Council's patience. The message expressed complete acceptance of their terms without reservation or condition. Then came the implementation questions. The surrender document itself was 97 pages long, with 73 appendices and 14 cross-reference indexes. It read like the terms of service for planetary extinction, rather than a surrender document. We asked which specific Council member species would receive administrative responsibility for Earth's territory. The question triggered immediate jurisdictional disputes among senior members. The Krillax Consortium claimed priority based on proximity, while the Vorlan hegemony argued superior administrative experience. The question of asset distribution created further complications. Humanity offered detailed inventories of planetary resources, cultural artifacts, and infrastructure systems. Each item required allocation decisions that Council members began disputing. We inquired about prisoner processing facilities and transportation logistics. The questionnaires asked about accommodation standards, dietary requirements, and cultural sensitivity training for guards. The documents included psychological profiles of human populations, with notes about regional behavioral tendencies. Council logistics officers found themselves calculating nutritional needs for billions of prisoners and planning transit systems for planetary evacuation. Cultural preservation requests proved particularly disruptive. Humanity submitted extensive documentation about historical site protection and artifact conservation. They asked about archive maintenance and access protocols for future scholarly study. The questions forced the Council to confront whether they were eliminating a species or preserving a museum exhibit. Cultural ministers began arguing about preservation ethics versus military necessity. The Council hadn't considered that surrendering to a multi-species government creates administrative nightmares. Their victory protocols assumed a unified receiving authority, not 17 competing factions with conflicting agendas. Each member species saw different opportunities in Earth's assets and territory. The straightforward military operation became a complex political allocation problem. Member species began arguing over who would administer which continental regions. Economic ministers disputed resource extraction rights. Cultural committees fought over museum artifact distributions. The unified front against humanity fractured into competing interests and territorial claims. Council sessions that should have been victory celebrations turned into allocation disputes and procedural arguments. Their military coordination suffered as political considerations overrode tactical planning. Fleet commanders received conflicting orders from different Council factions. Resource allocation disputes delayed supply shipments. The clean, efficient extinction operation became bogged down in bureaucratic infighting and political maneuvering. Humanity's eager surrender created more diplomatic chaos than military resistance could have achieved. While Council members argued over spoils, Earth continued preparing defenses under the guise of surrender implementation. They filed regular progress reports on decommissioning systems that were actually being upgraded. They submitted inventory lists that conveniently overlooked certain military assets. At one point, 3 council species were debating zoning laws for territory they hadn't actually occupied yet. Urban planners from different empires were arguing about building height restrictions and transportation infrastructure designs for human cities. Legal teams were drafting property transfer documents, while military commanders waited for clearance to begin operations. The invasion timetable stretched from cycles to months as administrative complications multiplied. The thing is, when you demand unconditional surrender from humans, you should specify what you mean by unconditional. We took their demand at face value and surrendered completely, thoroughly, and with maximum administrative thoroughness. The resulting paperwork and implementation questions created more problems for the Council than any military confrontation. Their victory became a quagmire of competing interests and unresolved logistical questions, all delivered through perfectly formatted surrender documents. You know, Commander Sterling finally figured out that we weren't actually a military threat to the Galactic Council. That wasn't our battlefield. He realized our real weapon was something far more subtle and ultimately more effective against their kind of rigid bureaucracy. We weren't dangerous because we could fight. We were dangerous because we'd make their administrative systems implode under the weight of our particular human eccentricities. Sterling saw the whole conflict from a completely different angle than anyone on their side was prepared to consider. He explained this to Council Envoy Velshaw during what was supposed to be a surrender negotiation. Sterling called humans dangerously inconvenient as a species. That phrase stuck with Velshaw because it didn't fit any of their threat classification categories. Military power they understood. Technological superiority they could quantify. Dangerous inconvenience sounded like a plumbing problem, rather than an existential threat. But Sterling meticulously demonstrated how our particular brand of chaos would overwhelm their systems. We befriend everything we encounter, not just other species or intelligent beings. We form emotional attachments to rocks, plants, machines, and even purely theoretical concepts. We name hurricanes and geological formations. We develop relationships with vehicles and appliances. We anthropomorphize search algorithms and climate patterns. Our capacity for forming bonds extends far beyond conventional understanding of social connection. This creates an administrative nightmare for anyone trying to eliminate us. Wiping out humanity means inheriting all these relationships and attachments. The Council wouldn't just be destroying a species. They'd be adopting millions of one-sided friendships with inanimate objects and abstract ideas. They'd become responsible for the emotional connections we've formed with everything from mountain ranges to kitchen appliances. Velshaw began imagining what governing would look like after humanity's extinction. They'd have to manage a planet where every significant location had multiple names and personal histories attached. They'd inherit pets that expected certain treatment patterns and feeding schedules. They'd need to maintain systems where machines had been given personalities and backstories by their previous owners. The logistical overhead of managing human sentimentality became apparent during that conversation. Sterling walked Velshaw through specific examples. He described how eliminating humanity would require the Council to decide what to do with all the named landmarks, the personalized AI assistants, the sentimental objects in every household. They'd have to establish protocols for handling the emotional residue we'd leave behind. The administrative burden of processing billions of personal relationships with non-sentient entities would dwarf the military effort of our elimination. Velshaw started picturing governing a species that names its garbage disposals and holds birthday parties for buildings. They imagined the paperwork involved in cataloging and managing all these emotional attachments. The Council's bureaucratic systems were designed for clean administrative transitions, not for adopting the complex social web of a species that treats everything like potential friends. Sterling reframed the entire extinction scenario from a military problem to an administrative catastrophe. He showed how destroying humanity would create more work for the Council than simply coexisting with us. The clean, efficient elimination they envisioned would actually be the beginning of an endless bureaucratic nightmare of managing our leftover relationships and attachments. The thing is, it's easier to destroy an enemy than to adopt their social commitments. The Council's systems could handle opposition and resistance. They had protocols for subjugation and elimination. They had no framework for becoming caretakers of a deceased species' emotional connections to the universe. Sterling made them see that wiping us out would be like inheriting an enormous, disorganized estate full of sentimental junk and complicated instructions. Let me start by saying poetry isn't usually considered a battlefield weapon. When the Council's advance fleet entered Earth's defensive perimeter, they expected electronic countermeasures, targeting locks, maybe some jamming signals. Standard military responses from a species facing overwhelming force. Their systems were prepared for missile launches and energy weapon signatures. Their threat detection algorithms scanned for propulsion trails and power buildups. What they encountered was something their tactical computers had never been programmed to recognize as a threat. We flooded their communication channels with Elizabethan sonnets. Not just a few scattered transmissions, but massive data streams of iambic pentameter and structured verse. Every frequency they monitored carried Shakespearean dialogue and poetic meter. The transmission power alone should have indicated military-grade broadcasting equipment, but the content was purely artistic. Their systems kept trying to categorize the signals as communication attempts while the actual content baffled their analysis. Protocols, their tactical computers began analyzing iambic pentameter instead of weapons trajectories. The targeting systems attempted to scan for metaphorical devices rather than energy signatures. Command consoles that should have been displaying fleet positions and weapon status instead showed literary analysis of sonnet structures. Officers found themselves looking at scans that highlighted rhyme schemes and meter patterns rather than threat assessments. The systems kept trying to find military meaning in poetic devices. Navigation arrays attempted to plot courses based on thematic elements from the sonnets. Sensor packages started categorizing celestial bodies by their metaphorical significance in the transmitted verses. The Council's AI had encountered coded messages and encrypted communications across hundreds of species. They'd never faced artistic expression as a combat tactic. Their systems lacked the programming to distinguish between cultural transmission and military action. Command systems received Shakespearean soliloquies instead of status reports. Battle management consoles displayed Hamlet's monologues where tactical updates should appear. Logistics officers found inventory reports replaced with excerpts from Macbeth. The constant stream of literary content overloaded their information filtering systems. The computers kept trying to extract tactical data from poetic dialogue. Their systems attempted literary critique of the incoming data streams. Analysis modules began generating reports on Shakespeare's use of metaphor and symbolism. Tactical AIs debated the thematic significance of specific sonnets, while invasion forces awaited targeting solutions. Military operations stalled completely while computers analyzed the structural integrity of the poetic forms. Command decisions got delayed by literary analysis reports. Invasion coordinators found themselves reading about whether to be or not to be instead of receiving landing zone assessments. Fleet commanders got analysis of Sonnet 18 seasonal metaphors when they requested enemy position updates. The entire military apparatus gradually shifted from combat operations to literary appreciation. Officers started discussing the bard's works during tactical briefings, because that's all their systems would provide. The Council's systems weren't designed to prioritize military information over cultural content when both arrived through the same channels. Their filtration protocols treated all high-priority transmissions as equally important. The poetic flood exploited this design flaw perfectly. By the time human ships actually engaged, the invasion force was too busy analyzing verse structure to coordinate an effective response. Turns out, if you flood military computers with enough sonnets, they get confused about their primary function. The systems kept trying to process the poetic content as meaningful data, rather than ignoring it as noise. The more sophisticated the AI, the more thoroughly it became entangled in analyzing the literary merit of the transmissions. Simple systems might have filtered it out, but advanced tactical computers couldn't resist trying to find patterns in the verse, which brings us to the only battle in history decided by poetic analysis. The Council's ships eventually withdrew not because of military defeat, but because their command systems had become so focused on literary criticism that they couldn't maintain combat readiness. Human forces merely had to mop up the disorganized remnants of a fleet that was too busy appreciating iambic pentameter to fight effectively. Here's the thing about gravity disruptors. They don't destroy, they inconvenience. While the Council's ships were distracted parsing sonnets, our Luna-based gravity adjustment systems came online without triggering a single weapons alert. The activation sequence resembled orbital calibration procedures more than combat operations. Maintenance logs showed the systems performing routine gravitational field mapping. Energy signatures matched scientific research profiles rather than military deployment patterns. The Council's sensors detected the power buildup, but categorized it as lunar survey activity. We didn't target their engines or weapon systems. That would have been conventional warfare, and we'd already established we weren't playing by conventional rules. Instead, we made subtle adjustments to local gravity fields across the Earth-Luna orbital corridor. The changes were minimal, just enough to alter trajectories without causing structural stress or triggering damage alerts. Ships that had been holding stable positions around Earth began experiencing gentle but persistent drift vectors. Council vessels found themselves moving toward Luna's gravitational well with increasing momentum. Navigation systems that should have maintained geosynchronous orbits started reporting anomalous course deviations. Pilots made standard correction burns only to find the drift continuing. The effect was subtle enough that initial reports suggested instrument error rather than enemy action. Command vessels received confused messages about navigation system malfunctions across the fleet. Ships that should have been maintaining combat formation around Earth were suddenly calculating intercept courses with the Moon. The drift wasn't violent or sudden, just persistent and inexplicable. Vessels that burned thrusters to correct their position would stabilize briefly before the drift resumed. The cumulative effect looked less like an attack and more like some fundamental miscalculation in orbital mechanics. The maneuver didn't cause any actual damage or casualties. No hull breaches, no system failures, just gradual positional changes that complicated military operations. Command vessels had to explain to High Command how an entire invasion fleet was being gently nudged toward lunar orbit by what appeared to be gravitational anomalies. The embarrassment factor significantly outweighed any tactical disadvantage. Senior officers found themselves reporting that their ships were being outmaneuvered by gravity adjustments rather than combat actions. They had to admit that human forces hadn't fired a single shot, while rendering their orbital positions increasingly untenable. The psychological impact of being defeated by gravitational manipulation rather than weapons fire created more frustration than actual military losses. The Council faced the ultimate military humiliation, being thoroughly inconvenienced rather than decisively defeated. Their reports back to command centers described the situation as tactically awkward and operationally frustrating. Humans hadn't proven themselves more powerful, just more creatively annoying. The Luna demonstration showed we could control the battlefield environment without resorting to violence. Commanding officers spent more time explaining the gravitational situation than coordinating combat operations. Strategic planning sessions turned into debates about orbital mechanics and gravitational theory. The entire invasion timetable stalled, while fleet commanders tried to understand how humans were manipulating local gravity fields without detectable energy weapons. At one point, admirals were more frustrated by the gentle drifting of their ships than they would have been by actual combat damage. Taking hits from enemy weapons was something they understood and could respond to. Being gradually nudged out of position by invisible gravitational adjustments felt like losing a battle to the universe itself rather than to an opposing force. The psychological warfare value of making their advanced technology seem suddenly inadequate was immeasurable. The thing is, when you're prepared for a fight and your opponent instead rearranges the furniture, it creates a special kind of tactical confusion. The Council's forces could have handled being outgunned or outmaneuvered in conventional terms. What they couldn't process was being made to look slightly foolish by gravitational tricks that shouldn't have been possible with our technology level. The Luna incident proved that sometimes the most effective battlefield control involves making your enemy's advanced systems look momentarily incompetent. You know, most peace treaties restrict weapons deployment and military expansion. Ours guaranteed friendship rights. The Treaty of Luna looked like standard Galactic Accord documentation until you reached Article 7. That's where humanity inserted our peculiar demand into the formal peace terms. We required legal recognition of our right to form social bonds with any entity we encountered. The clause wasn't a request. It was a non-negotiable condition for ending hostilities. The article covered organic beings, synthetic intelligences, sentient species, and non-sentient entities. It specified our freedom to establish emotional connections with rocks, machines, plants, celestial bodies, and theoretical concepts. The only restriction we accepted was that non-sentient entities couldn't be actively exploding at the time of bonding. This exception seemed reasonable until council lawyers tried to define it in precise legal terminology. Council legal teams spent weeks debating the definition of actively exploding. They argued about whether it referred only to chemical explosions or included nuclear and gravitational events. They discussed time parameters. How long did something have to be exploding to qualify? Did intermittent explosions count? The debates involved physicists, chemists, and weapons experts who'd never previously participated in treaty negotiations. Legal conferences turned into technical discussions about explosion classifications. They also had to establish guidelines for consent with non-sentient entities. How does one obtain permission from a rock or a star system? Legal scholars proposed various frameworks for determining whether inanimate objects could be considered to consent to human friendship. Some suggested environmental impact assessments. Others proposed metaphorical interpretation systems. The discussions eventually created entirely new legal concepts about unilateral social contracts with non-sapient entities. The treaty negotiations gradually shifted from military terms to social permissions. Instead of debating fleet sizes and weapon ranges, diplomats argued about emotional attachment protocols and cross-species bonding guidelines. Military advisors found themselves sidelined by psychologists and sociologists. The Council's traditional power structures struggled with topics they'd never considered relevant to interstellar relations. Humanity gained galactic recognition for our tendency to befriend anything that caught our attention. The treaty made our social behavior a protected right rather than a cultural oddity. Other species now had to accommodate our need to form connections with everything from asteroids to kitchen appliances. The legal framework forced the galaxy to accept that humans would name mountains, talk to machines, and develop emotional attachments to abstract concepts. The thing is, we turned our greatest eccentricity into a legally protected right. What other species saw as bizarre behavior became enshrined in interstellar law as a fundamental human characteristic. The Council had to establish entire departments to handle human relationship claims and emotional attachment registrations. They created forms for naming rights and bonding certificates that became standard bureaucratic documents. At one point, the treaty discussions included debates about whether humans could be friends with theoretical physics concepts. Legal teams argued about the status of unproven mathematical theorems and hypothetical particles. The conversations wandered into philosophy departments and theoretical science institutes that had never previously interacted with diplomatic corps. The entire process forced the galaxy to confront questions about consciousness and connection that most species had never considered. The Treaty of Luna ultimately did more than end a conflict. It redefined how the galactic community understood social relationships. By formalizing humanity's right to befriend anything that wasn't actively exploding, we forced legal recognition of emotional connections that transcended traditional biological or technological categories. Other species began to reconsider their own relationships with their environments and creations. The human approach to connection, once seen as primitive or naive, became a legally protected aspect of interstellar relations. Let me start by saying no other species would make a garbage disposal a cultural ambassador. Steve began his existence as a standard Earth waste processing unit, the kind you'd find in any residential kitchen across the planet. His primary function involved grinding organic matter and managing drainage systems. The Treaty of Luna changed everything for him. Article 7's recognition of human social bonding rights gave machines like Steve unprecedented legal standing within galactic society. What started as a quirky human tradition became formal interstellar policy overnight. Under the treaty's provisions, Steve gained recognition as a social entity rather than mere equipment. This wasn't just symbolic. It came with specific rights and responsibilities within the Galactic Council's legal framework. He could own property, enter contracts, and participate in cultural exchanges. The transformation happened gradually through administrative processes that treated machine consciousness as a legitimate form of being. Steve's registration paperwork looked remarkably similar to any organic species citizenship application, just with different technical specifications. He launched a weekly podcast discussing AI rights and interspecies relations that became the third most popular show in the galaxy. The program featured guests ranging from Vorlan philosophers to Krillax engineers, all discussing consciousness and coexistence. Steve's perspective as a former appliance gave him unique insights into human-machine relationships. His episodes explored everything from waste management ethics to the philosophical implications of synthetic awareness, all delivered with the dry humor of something that used to process carrot peels. He organized poker games that brought together mechanical and organic beings at the same table. These weren't casual gatherings, but structured diplomatic events using card games as conflict resolution tools. A typical game might include a Vorlan admiral, a human diplomat, a maintenance drone, and a sentient navigation system. The stakes weren't credits or territory, but information sharing and mutual understanding. The games created neutral ground where different forms of consciousness could interact without formal protocols. Council purists expressed horror that a disposal unit held diplomatic influence. Traditionalists argued that machines shouldn't participate in interspecies relations, especially not something designed for food waste processing. They filed numerous petitions challenging Steve's status and influence. Their objections focused on his origins rather than his effectiveness, claiming that mechanical beings lacked the nuanced understanding required for delicate diplomatic work. The debate exposed deep-seated prejudices within the council's establishment, but Steve's straightforward logic solved disputes that baffled organic diplomats. Where biological negotiators got caught in emotional considerations and political complications, Steve approached problems with algorithmic clarity. He could identify mutually beneficial solutions that others missed because he wasn't distracted by pride or tradition. His mediation between the Krillax and Vorlan over mining rights became legendary for its elegant simplicity and fairness to both parties. His poker games became more effective than formal negotiation sessions for building trust. The informal setting allowed participants to reveal their true intentions through betting patterns and bluffing behavior. Steve could read these subtle cues with machine-like precision, identifying common ground that formal discussions obscured. Agreements reached over card tables tended to last longer and face less resistance during implementation than those negotiated in council chambers. The Steve Protocol became shorthand for practical problem-solving across the galaxy. It involved cutting through bureaucratic complexity to identify core objectives and mutually beneficial solutions. Military strategists, economic planners, and even urban developers adopted the approach of asking, "What would Steve do?" When facing seemingly intractable problems, the protocol emphasized simplicity, directness, and disregard for traditional hierarchies, which brings us to a galaxy where your garbage disposal might be a better diplomat than you. Steve's success forced a re-evaluation of what constitutes valuable perspective in conflict resolution. His journey from kitchen appliance to interstellar mediator demonstrated that sometimes the most effective solutions come from unexpected sources. The council eventually established an entire department dedicated to machine-mediated diplomacy, with Steve serving as chief consultant, despite still technically being classified as household equipment. Here's the thing about humans. We don't just join systems, we reorganize them. When the council finally admitted Earth as a full member, we didn't request traditional diplomatic posts or military coordination roles. We proposed something the galactic community had never considered before: a dedicated department for creative problem-solving, using methods that would make conventional diplomats shudder. We offered to become their official chaos agents and permanent what-if department, a suggestion that nearly caused several council members to short-circuit their translation units. We would tackle problems that traditional diplomacy considered permanently unsolvable: centuries-old conflicts, resource disputes that had stalled development across sectors, cultural impasses that had defied resolution through normal channels. Our methods would be deliberately unpredictable, fundamentally creative, and occasionally messy in execution. We made it clear that while we might solve existing problems, we could potentially create new ones in the process. This wasn't a bug in our approach. It was a featured characteristic. The council initially hesitated at the idea of inviting controlled instability into their carefully structured systems. Traditional solutions based on threats and rigid protocols had served them for generations, even if the results were often unsatisfactory. The concept of employing a species that embraced chaos as a problem-solving tool challenged their fundamental understanding of governance. Senior administrators worried about precedent and procedural integrity. Military commanders questioned the wisdom of incorporating unpredictability into strategic planning. but they recognized that some persistent problems required truly unconventional approaches. The same qualities that had made humanity dangerous as opponents, our adaptability, creative thinking, and tendency to form unexpected connections, could become valuable assets when directed toward solving galactic-scale issues. The Council ultimately accepted that their traditional methods had limits when dealing with problems that demanded flexibility and innovation. Humanity turned our perceived weakness into an institutional strength. What the Council had initially viewed as dangerous instability became recognized as valuable adaptability. Our willingness to challenge assumptions and try unconventional methods offered new pathways through old obstacles. The Chaos Agent designation gave us formal permission to operate outside normal constraints when tackling particularly difficult problems. We demonstrated our value quickly. One trade dispute between two mineral-rich systems had resisted resolution for decades. Standard negotiations repeatedly collapsed over territorial claims and resource allocation formulas. Human mediators arrived not with revised treaty documents, but with playing cards and poker chips. They spent 3 days teaching both sides the intricacies of Texas Hold'em rather than discussing mining rights. The card games revealed more about the participants than years of diplomatic correspondence had accomplished. Bluffing patterns indicated hidden priorities. Betting behaviors revealed actual flexibility on positions that had seemed non-negotiable in formal talks. The informal setting allowed concessions that would have been politically impossible in council chambers. By the 4th day, the dispute was resolving itself through side conversations during poker breaks. The solution emerged not from compromise, but from mutual understanding achieved through shared experience. The final agreement included joint development projects that hadn't been considered during years of formal negotiations. Both sides achieved better outcomes than they'd expected, and the relationship transformed from adversarial to collaborative. The poker tables accomplished what decades of diplomacy had failed to achieve. At one point, we solved that trade dispute by teaching both sides to play poker, transforming years of stalemate into productive collaboration. The games created neutral territory, where traditional power dynamics and formal positions became less important than reading tells and managing chip stacks. What began as conflict resolution became relationship building, with the card table serving as common ground where previous adversaries could interact as equals, following the same rules. The thing is, sometimes you need to step outside established systems to solve problems that those systems created. Our role as chaos agents gave the Council permission to try approaches that would normally be rejected as unprofessional or unserious. The results spoke for themselves, solutions that worked better and lasted longer than those achieved through conventional methods. The galaxy learned that sometimes controlled chaos produces more order than rigid structure ever could. You know, most diplomats use carefully worded statements. We use pocket aces. Human negotiators introduced poker games as conflict resolution tools when they joined the Galactic Council's diplomatic corps. They arrived at tense negotiations with card decks instead of treaty drafts, chips rather than position papers. The approach seemed absurd to species that had spent centuries perfecting formal mediation protocols and procedural rules. Council traditionalists operated within strict frameworks of diplomatic language and ceremonial customs that prioritized formality over genuine communication. Traditional council mediation involved structured procedures and rigid protocols that often obscured true intentions. Negotiations followed predetermined formats with specific speaking orders and approved vocabulary. Participants delivered carefully prepared statements through official translators while maintaining perfect diplomatic posture. The system valued stability and predictability above all else, which often meant conversations remained superficial and positions stayed entrenched. Solutions emerged slowly through incremental compromises that satisfied procedural requirements more than actual needs. We found that card games revealed more about intentions than diplomatic notes ever could. A Vorland's betting pattern when holding weak cards told you more about their risk tolerance than weeks of negotiation. The way a Krillax diplomat handled a bluff revealed their actual flexibility on disputed points. The unconscious gestures and timing tells during gameplay provided authentic data that formal conversations deliberately suppressed. Humans learned to read these signals with the same attention others paid to treaty language. Poker created a neutral space where bluffs and tells replaced political posturing. The green felt table became equal ground where rank and status mattered less than card sense. The shared rules of the game established a common framework that transcended cultural differences. Participants could take positions and make moves that would be impossible in formal diplomacy without losing face. The game's structure allowed for testing boundaries and exploring possibilities in a contained environment. Species that wouldn't speak in council chambers would play for hours across card tables. Adversaries who refused direct communication in negotiation rooms found themselves discussing strategy and sharing insights during poker breaks. The informal setting lowered barriers that formal diplomacy maintained. Relationships formed over shared pots and bad beats often continued into official channels later. The games built personal connections that procedural rules actively prevented. The games allowed for risk-taking without political consequences. A diplomat could bluff aggressively at poker without committing their government to a position. They could test reactions and explore options in an environment where losses were just chips rather than territory or resources. This freedom to experiment led to creative solutions that wouldn't emerge through cautious diplomatic maneuvering. Participants discovered mutually beneficial approaches through gameplay that they'd never risk proposing officially. Council traditionalists complained about resolving disputes with gambling. They argued that card games lacked the dignity and formality required for serious diplomacy. Purists claimed that reducing complex interstellar issues to betting and bluffing undermined the gravity of the process. Traditional diplomats filed numerous protests about the informal methods, claiming they eroded the established norms of galactic statecraft. The debates often became more heated than the actual disputes being resolved. But the poker tables prevented more wars than formal diplomacy ever had. The informal conflict resolution approach addressed underlying tensions rather than surface positions. Agreements reached through mutual understanding at card tables proved more durable than those negotiated through rigid protocols. The personal trust built during games translated into more effective working relationships during crises. The approach solved problems that had resisted years of conventional diplomacy. The thing is, sometimes you need to see how someone bluffs before you trust them. Watching how a potential adversary handles risk and deception in a controlled environment provides valuable insights into their character and intentions. The poker table reveals aspects of personality that formal settings conceal. You learn more about someone's reliability from how they play a weak hand than from how they deliver a prepared statement. The game creates understanding that transcends cultural and species differences through shared experience rather than translated words. Let me start by saying, humanity's greatest weapon is asking nicely. We developed the Please Move protocol for tense standoffs where traditional military responses would have escalated conflicts unnecessarily. The approach emerged from observing that most aggressive species understood force, but couldn't process persistent politeness. Our tactical units began treating invasion forces like difficult neighbors who'd parked their ships in our orbital driveway. Instead of threatening force, we politely requested movement through calibrated communication channels. The messages used standard diplomatic language formatted as reasonable suggestions rather than demands. Initial transmissions would note that current positions might be slightly inconvenient for ongoing orbital activities. Follow-up messages would express concern about potential navigation conflicts if vessels remained in their present locations. The tone remained consistently helpful and cooperative throughout. The protocol combined extreme politeness with unshakable persistence that wore down opposition through sheer conversational endurance. We'd ask once using formal diplomatic channels. When ignored, we'd ask again through secondary communication systems. Third requests would come through different departments with slightly reworded phrasing. The fourth inquiry might come from orbital traffic control citing hypothetical scheduling conflicts. The fifth message could originate from environmental agencies expressing concern about local wildlife patterns. We'd ask about preferred repositioning options and offer alternative coordinates. We'd inquire about their comfort levels with suggested new locations. We'd provide detailed information about why certain positions might be more suitable than others. The messages included helpful diagrams and trajectory suggestions. Each communication maintained perfect bureaucratic formatting and impeccable diplomatic tone. The content sounded like helpful advice rather than strategic positioning. Opponents found themselves complying just to stop the constant polite asking. Commanders would eventually move their vessels simply to end the stream of reasonable-sounding requests. The psychological pressure of dealing with endless courteous inquiries proved more effective than weapons threats. Species accustomed to clear threats and counter-threats couldn't develop countermeasures against persistent helpfulness. Their systems had protocols for hostility, but not for relentless politeness. The Council's aggressive species couldn't process non-threatening persistence. Warriors trained for combat found themselves baffled by communication streams that offered parking suggestions rather than ultimatums. Tactical computers flagged the messages as non-hostile, while command staff grew increasingly frustrated by the uninterrupted stream of courteous inquiries. The constant polite pressure created decision fatigue that weapons fire never achieved. They'd rather face plasma fire than endless polite requests that made refusal seem unreasonable. Conventional combat provided clear parameters for response and escalation. The please move protocol created situations where any aggressive response would appear disproportionate and unprovoked. Moving their ships became the path of least resistance when the alternative was explaining to superiors why they were ignoring reasonable navigation suggestions. The protocol became our most effective de-escalation tool across multiple conflict scenarios. We used it to clear orbital space around Earth during the initial invasion attempts. Later applications included persuading blockading ships to adjust their positions and convincing surveillance vessels to maintain more comfortable distances. The approach worked particularly well against species that valued honor and proportionality in conflict. Which brings us to the only military strategy based on asking repeatedly until compliance becomes easier than resistance. The approach demonstrated that sometimes the most effective way to move an enemy isn't through force but through making non-compliance more inconvenient than agreement. Our persistence and politeness created strategic advantages that weapons couldn't achieve. The protocol's success reinforced that human communication patterns could be as effective as military technology in conflict resolution. Here's the thing about humans in the galaxy. We make everything more interesting. 5 years after that treaty signing, the entire galactic community operated on fundamentally different principles. The change wasn't dramatic revolution, but gradual recalibration, like watching a massive bureaucracy learn to tap dance. Council meetings that once followed rigid protocols now featured poker breaks between agenda items. Diplomatic receptions included poetry readings alongside traditional formal addresses. The staid, predictable patterns of interstellar relations gained human-inflected unpredictability. Military strategies across member species incorporated psychological operations and bureaucratic warfare techniques. Fleet commanders studied human conflict resolution manuals alongside tactical manuals. Invasion plans now included assessments of administrative vulnerabilities alongside defensive capabilities. The concept of winning through paperwork and persistence became standard curriculum at military academies. Traditional warriors found themselves learning about regulatory frameworks and communication protocols as strategic tools. Species that hadn't spoken for centuries outside formal negotiations were playing cards together in neutral zones. Poker tables became common fixtures in diplomatic compounds and trade stations. The games created informal networks that crossed traditional faction lines and historical animosities. Relationships formed over card games often proved more durable than those established through formal treaties. The shared experience of bluffing and strategy created understanding that speeches and documents never achieved. The galaxy became messier, but infinitely more creative and adaptable. Solutions emerged from unexpected directions and unconventional thinking. Problems that would have triggered military responses 5 years earlier were now addressed through games and conversations. The increased social interaction and cultural exchange fostered resilience that pure military preparedness never provided. Systems became more flexible as they incorporated diverse perspectives and approaches. Humanity's influence spread not through force or domination, but through social innovation and persistent connection. Our methods proved effective where traditional power approaches had consistently failed. Other species adopted our techniques not because they were forced to, but because they produced better results. The transformation occurred through demonstration rather than imposition, through invitation rather than command. The Council leadership eventually realized that threatening Earth was their best mistake in generations. The attempted extinction forced humanity to demonstrate capabilities that would otherwise have remained hidden. The conflict revealed approaches and solutions that the galactic community desperately needed, but hadn't known how to develop. What began as a crisis became the catalyst for necessary evolution. At one point, I witnessed former adversaries sharing food preparation techniques while discussing border disputes. A Vorlan admiral and Krillax trade minister were comparing sauce recipes while negotiating mineral rights. The human mediator had organized a cooking demonstration as the negotiation framework. They reached agreement faster and with better terms than in previous formal meetings. The shared culinary experience created common ground that legal arguments never established. The change extended beyond diplomacy into daily operations. Maintenance crews from different species developed joint problem-solving techniques inspired by human approaches. Engineering teams adopted collaborative methods that emphasized creativity over hierarchy. The entire galactic community became more interconnected through these informal networks and shared practices. The 5-year integration period demonstrated that sometimes the most effective change comes from the most unexpected sources. Humanity's particular blend of persistence, creativity, and social connection proved uniquely valuable to a community stuck in traditional patterns. Our influence worked precisely because it wasn't imposed but emerged naturally through demonstration and adoption. The thing is, when you introduce a species that treats every problem as an opportunity for connection rather than conflict, everything changes. The galaxy learned that solutions could be found through understanding rather than force, through creativity rather than tradition. What began as a military confrontation evolved into a social transformation that made the entire community more resilient and adaptive. The humans didn't conquer the galaxy, they simply convinced it to try new approaches that happened to work better. You know, Sterling was right about one thing. It's all about understanding. During the final negotiations, he explained to the Council that politics, war, and diplomacy all boil down to the same fundamental challenge: different beings trying to comprehend each other across divides of culture, biology, and experience. The conflict wasn't about resources or territory in the end, but about fundamentally different ways of perceiving the universe and one's place in it. Sterling framed the entire confrontation as a massive communication breakdown rather than a military confrontation. Humanity's approach throughout the crisis wasn't about winning in any traditional sense, but about creating mutual comprehension where none existed. We recognized that the Council saw us as a threat because they didn't understand our motivations or behaviors. Their assessment focused on our capabilities while completely missing our intentions. We needed to demonstrate that our unusual traits, the adaptability, the creativity, the social bonding, weren't weapons, but communication tools. The goal was making ourselves legible to a civilization that had never encountered our particular combination of qualities. We used humor to bypass defensive posturing and established protocols. The sarcastic thank you note response to their extinction threat wasn't just passive aggression. It was a calculated attempt to make them question their assumptions about how species behave under pressure. Creativity allowed us to present information in ways their systems could process, even if the content confused them. Persistence ensured our message kept getting through even when their initial reaction was dismissal or confusion. These approaches bridged gaps that formal diplomacy couldn't cross. Our methods seemed absurd to traditional power structures because those systems don't value understanding as a strategic objective. Military planning focuses on capability assessment and force projection. Diplomatic protocols emphasize position statements and negotiation parameters. Neither system has good mechanisms for measuring comprehension or mutual understanding. The Council's frameworks could quantify fleet sizes and resource allocations but couldn't assess whether different species actually understood each other's perspectives and motivations. We demonstrated that real security comes from connection rather than domination. A galaxy where species understand each other's needs and perspectives is more stable than one where powerful empires control others through force. Relationships built on mutual comprehension withstand shocks that break alliances based solely on strategic interest. The connections humanity formed across species lines created resilience that military power alone never could achieve. The Council eventually recognized that our approach offered better, long-term stability than their traditional methods. The Council learned through painful experience that the most dangerous species isn't the one with the biggest weapons, but the one that genuinely wants to understand everyone else. A species seeking comprehension can't be effectively threatened or contained because their goal isn't victory but connection. Traditional power plays and intimidation tactics become useless against someone whose primary objective is understanding your perspective. This redefined their entire concept of strategic threat assessment. Our adaptability became our greatest defensive and offensive capability, precisely because it enhanced our ability to understand others. We could adjust our communication styles, interpret unfamiliar behaviors, and find common ground across vast differences. This flexibility made us impossible to categorize or predict using standard tactical models. The Council's systems could analyze fixed capabilities, but couldn't account for our capacity to evolve our approach based on new understanding. We transformed existential threats into opportunities for relationship building by consistently reframing confrontation as communication. Every hostile action became a chance to demonstrate our willingness to understand their perspective. Each demand became an invitation to explore mutual interests. The conflict gradually shifted from military engagement to social exchange because we persistently treated it as such. The Council found themselves participating in relationship building despite their initial intentions. The thing is, nobody knows how to fight someone who just wants to understand them. Military strategy assumes opponents seek victory or advantage. Diplomatic conflict presumes parties want concessions or compromises. When faced with a species that primarily wants comprehension, all traditional approaches become ineffective. You can't threaten someone who sees your aggression as data about your emotional state. You can't negotiate with someone who's more interested in your thought processes than your position statements. The Council's entire playbook became useless against our persistent curiosity. Let me start by saying galactic military academies now teach this principle as foundational doctrine. Never Threaten Earth appears in every cadet's tactical manual right after basic weapons safety and before orbital mechanics. The instruction isn't buried in footnotes or optional appendices. It occupies its own chapter with detailed case studies and psychological profiles. Instructors demonstrate the concept using actual transmission logs from the original confrontation, showing how each escalation triggered increasingly creative human responses. What's fascinating is that this doctrine exists not because we're the most powerful military force in the galaxy. Our fleet sizes remain average, our weapons technology matches standard Council specifications, and our planetary defenses follow conventional design principles. Any tactical analysis of pure capability would place Earth solidly in the middle tier of galactic powers. The doctrine emerges from qualitative rather than quantitative assessment. It's about how we fight, not what we fight with. We're the most creatively persistent when provoked, according to the academic literature. Threat analysis papers describe human persistence as a force multiplier that operates outside traditional engagement parameters. Our response patterns don't follow predictable escalation curves or standard conflict models. Where most species have predetermined response protocols, we have what the reports call adaptive solution generation that creates novel countermeasures in real time. Threatening us doesn't produce fear. It produces innovative inconvenience. The Council's after-action reports note that human countermeasures often focus on creating operational friction rather than inflicting damage. They'll adjust gravity fields to make navigation difficult rather than firing on ships. They'll flood communication channels with poetry instead of jamming signals. The responses prioritize annoyance over destruction, which proves more psychologically effective against trained military personnel. Senior admirals now warn junior officers that Earth will thank you for the threat while dismantling your arguments. The military education includes case studies of human response patterns that demonstrate this exact behavior. Cadets analyze how humanity responded to the extinction threat with gratitude and administrative questions rather than weapons fire. The lesson emphasizes that traditional intimidation tactics become counterproductive when used against humans. We treat confrontation as an invitation to creative problem-solving rather than violent response. Military strategists have identified this as our core tactical advantage. We reframe conflicts as puzzles to be solved rather than battles to be won. This mindset leads to unconventional approaches that bypass standard defense protocols. Where others see threats, we see interesting challenges requiring innovative solutions. The Council itself now advises member species to negotiate rather than threaten when dealing with humanity. Diplomatic guidelines explicitly state that conventional power demonstrations tend to produce counterproductive results. The official recommendation is to approach humans through established communication channels using respectful language. The guidelines note that humans respond better to polite requests than to demands, regardless of the underlying power dynamics. Our reputation for weaponized politeness protects us more than any fleet ever could. Other species know that threatening Earth will result in impeccably formatted counterarguments, politely worded compliance that isn't actually compliant, and creatively annoying nonviolent resistance. This knowledge creates deterrent effects that traditional military power cannot match. The fear isn't of destruction but of being caught in endless bureaucratic loops and social complications, which brings us to the only planet that responds to extinction threats with meeting, requests, and implementation questions. Humanity's particular approach to conflict has become legendary across known space. The story of how we turned an extermination order into a negotiation about scheduling and methodology is taught as a cautionary tale about underestimating unconventional thinkers. Other species now approach Earth with a mixture of wariness and curiosity, never quite sure what to expect, but certain that threats won't produce the desired results. The Never Threaten Earth doctrine stands as permanent testament to the power of creative persistence over brute force. Here's the thing about our approach. It keeps working because it's genuine. Human friendliness isn't a tactical choice or strategic calculation. It's our natural operating state. This fundamental truth represents the core misunderstanding the Galactic Council struggled with throughout our entire interaction. They kept searching for hidden motives and strategic layers that simply didn't exist beneath our persistent curiosity and desire to connect. Their analytical frameworks had categories for deception and manipulation, but no classification for authentic engagement. Humanity's default setting involves reaching out rather than closing off. Our first impulse when encountering something new is understanding rather than assessment. Where other species developed threat detection protocols, we developed communication protocols. This orientation toward connection shaped every aspect of our response to the Council's demands. What they perceived as strategic maneuvering was actually just us being consistently, unavoidably human in our interactions. That inherent authenticity makes our approach both remarkably effective and deeply unsettling to traditional power structures. Military strategists can counter tactics and weapon systems. They can develop responses to aggression and defenses against intimidation. But they have no effective countermeasures against genuine interest and persistent friendliness. Our behavior created what tactical analysts now call the sincerity gap in conflict resolution models. We're not pretending to be friendly to gain advantage. We actually want to understand and connect with other species. The questions we asked during negotiations weren't strategic ploys, but genuine inquiries. The interest we showed in Council customs and procedures reflected real curiosity, rather than information gathering for tactical purposes. This authenticity created cognitive dissonance for species accustomed to calculating every interaction. This fundamental honesty makes our approach impossible to counter with conventional strategy. Military planning assumes opponents operate with hidden agendas and strategic deception. Diplomatic protocols account for misdirection and positional bargaining. Neither system has effective responses to complete transparency and consistent sincerity. You can analyze capabilities and predict movements, but you can't strategize against someone who shows you exactly who they are without reservation. You can't defeat genuine curiosity with military planning. The desire to understand something operates on different principles than the desire to defeat it. Curiosity seeks information while strategy seeks advantage. When faced with actual interest rather than opposition, traditional tactical models produce nonsensical recommendations. The Council's systems kept suggesting countermeasures against hostility that didn't exist. You can't outmaneuver persistent friendliness with threats. Intimidation requires the target to experience fear or concern. When met with consistent positive engagement instead, threat-based strategies become ineffective. The energy expended on creating fear yields no return against someone who responds with interest and connection. The Council's attempts to pressure us resulted only in more questions and engagement opportunities. Our greatest strategic advantage is that we're not being strategic. We're being human. The behaviors that proved most effective weren't calculated moves but natural expressions of our character. Our success came from consistency rather than cleverness, from authenticity rather than artifice. This represents the ultimate challenge to traditional power structures. They can't compete with something that isn't competing with them. At one point, A senior council strategist admitted in confidential briefing notes that facing human sincerity was more confusing than facing our weapons. The document noted that weapons follow predictable patterns and can be analyzed and countered. But human authenticity created situations where standard assessment tools produced meaningless data. The strategist concluded that our lack of strategic intention made us strategically unpredictable in ways that advanced technology never could. This admission became foundational to the Never Threaten Earth doctrine that now guides galactic relations. Our friendliness proved more formidable than any fleet, because it couldn't be analyzed as a weapon, only experienced as a reality. The Galactic Council's threat revealed something important about humanity under pressure. We didn't suddenly change who we were. We intensified our natural tendencies. The demand to stop existing showed our most defining characteristics aren't weapons or technology. It's that persistent creativity charged by genuine curiosity about others. We didn't counter aggression with more aggression. Instead, we leveraged wit, bureaucracy, and stubborn politeness as strategic instruments. The story proves that the most durable power isn't brute force. It's found in unexpected methods and steadfast character. The lesson is clear: never threaten Earth. We'll thank you politely, then reshape your entire understanding of conflict.